On the evening of May 6, 1937, the LZ-129 Hindenburg, delayed by rough weather, attempted to land in a small town in New Jersey. But something had gone horribly wrong. The hydrogen gas that filled the airship began to leak. A spark, possibly caused by static electricity, started a chain reaction, and within seconds, the airship was engulfed in flames. This moment is easily one of the most infamous transportation disasters in history, and often cited as the moment where the golden age of airships came to an end. Or at least that's how the story goes. So what if the Hindenburg disaster never happened? What if the airship landed safely? Well, after the Hindenburg crash in our timeline, the Zeppelin company still made airships. One airship. The LZ-130 Graf Zeppelin II. At first, the manager of the Zeppelin company wanted to use helium rather than hydrogen, because helium doesn't explode. But there's a problem. Most of the world's helium supplies were controlled by the United States, and the Zeppelin company was German. And this was the late 1930s. The US wasn't willing to give Germany access to a gas that could be used in war balloons right after they invaded Austria. So the Graf Zeppelin II was forced to use hydrogen, and rather than risk passengers' lives, the airship was limited to only military operations, primarily recon. They were effectively useless in combat. By World War II, anti-aircraft guns were designed to take out much smaller and faster airplanes, so these big, bulky, and slow airships were nothing but an easy target. The airships didn't contribute enough to the war effort, and eventually the Germans destroyed the existing Zeppelins for scrap metal. But if the Hindenburg never burst into flames, would things have been kind of different? I guess. The Graf Zeppelin could have carried passengers for a few more years, but sooner or later, it would have been thrown into the scrap pile like all the rest. You gotta look at the airship objectively for a moment. Beyond being big and looking cool, what do they offer that an airplane doesn't? Yeah, they can stay in the air longer, but they're also much slower. They can allow for more space and room than your average passenger plane, but they aren't as luxurious as, say, a cruise ship. Famously, the piano in the lounge of the Hindenburg had to be made out of aluminum, because a real piano would weigh too much. Even though they were massive, they couldn't carry that many passengers, and they were usually reserved for the wealthy. Eventually, planes could get people across the oceans faster than airships, and had their own accommodations. There just wasn't a need for these things anymore. Wow, that is not a satisfying answer. That's not really fun. Airships always seemed like they had untapped potential, and maybe they did. That's why asking the question, what if the Hindenburg didn't explode, is so alluring to many people, because this alternate age of the airship is what a lot imagine was a possibility. But sadly, we weren't going to get that, whether the Hindenburg landed safely or not. We aren't going to find that in the 20th century. No, instead, we have to go further back before the Hindenburg was designed, to a time before airplanes were even imagined, back to the 18th century. Hot air rises, and if you can contain that air, you can create lift. The Montgolfier brothers took this into account when developing the first large-scale hot air balloons in France during the late 1700s. And coincidentally, around the same time, the Robert brothers, who also happened to be French, were working on their own balloon. Assisted by Jacques Charles, this balloon didn't use hot air, it used hydrogen. Both teams demonstrated their projects to large crowds over the course of 1783, and managed to attract global attention. After the Montgolfiers had enough unmanned tests, they decided to finally put somebody in one of these things. Neither of the brothers were willing to take the chance, though. In fact, no human was going for the first flight. It would be a 3-member team consisting of a rooster, a sheep, and a duck. And to many people's surprise, they did not die. The Montgolfiers and Robert brothers would eventually get humans to ride in their balloons. It was a big deal, and watching from the sidelines was Benjamin Franklin, who just happened to be in France at the time as an American diplomat. Intrigued by these flying machines, Benjamin Franklin would write to several colleagues. He imagined they could be quite useful. for war. In fact, even the Montgolfiers themselves had already considered the amazing potential of balloons in warfare. While they weren't perfect flying machines, after all, they would just go where the winds would take them, they had one unique quality that would make them unstoppable. It was literally that. Nobody could stop them. This was the late 1700s. Firearms didn't have the accuracy or range to shoot these things out of the sky. And if they were utilized properly, these balloons could change the face of warfare. Ben Franklin proposed that if you took 5,000 of these balloons, each occupied by 2 men, and sent them over enemy territory, you would just simply overwhelm them. But, this never happened. Soon after these first flights, the French would become preoccupied with, other things, and the British viewed all this balloon stuff as French nonsense. It would probably be useless, and French, so they just never bothered looking into any of it. Then the Americans could barely sustain a military force, let alone an elite squad of balloonists. So for the next century, this technology really just stagnated. Beyond a few forward-thinking, albeit impractical concepts, this whole technology didn't progress all that much during the next century. But let's imagine right here, in the 1700s, we see a point of divergence creating an alternate timeline. For whatever reason, Louis XVI is completely entranced by his nation's newest creation. He decides to allocate a large amount of money and resources towards continued development and production of both hydrogen and hot air balloons. Cool. This would still be a problem. Hydrogen is the most common element in the universe, but in the late 1700s, it wasn't that easy to obtain. In fact, for the past few decades, it was just referred to as inflammable air, because all it would do was catch on fire. You know, explode, making it incredibly dangerous and difficult to produce. If the French were inspired by Ben Franklin's suggestion, and they did plan on building 5,000 balloons, they would have to be hot air balloons. So, in 1785, Ben Franklin leaves France and returns to the US, bringing with him the French's newfound love of all things air travel. The US, which is in deep financial trouble and already trying to shrink its military, certainly couldn't afford any federal spending on an unproven technology, and the British would still not care about balloons at all. Once again, too French. Back in France, the exorbitant spending on balloon research is seen as par for the course for the French elite. The balloons, while still being developed for war, would end up mostly being a status of wealth and power for the rich, which would make them enticing targets as the French Revolution got underway. These balloons would most likely be destroyed or commandeered by the revolutionaries. Many would be used for scouting, something that actually happened in our timeline. Yes, the French Aerostatic Corps was the first aerial-based military unit, using the balloons for reconnaissance during the Battle of Fleurus. But in this alternate timeline, a few important changes are made to the balloons to make them more effective in combat, or effective at all in combat. The idea of balloon warfare in the late 1700s was based around the idea that this flying machine couldn't be touched. No firearm would be accurate enough to take it out from a distance. Unfortunately, this also means that no firearm could be used from the hot air balloon all that effectively as well. But you could drop bombs, primitive bombs, small bombs. These balloons had a very limited weight capacity, although you could imagine low altitude balloons being equipped with iron grenades set with fairly long fuses, something that would be ideal for hitting royal structures and causing a good deal of chaos in the streets of Paris. A lot of chaos, for both sides. Not much would result from these bombing raids, if you could even call them that, but it would certainly cause a lot of heads to turn. With the introduction of any new technology into warfare, the impact of that technology is often disputed, but many initial claims tend to overestimate the ability and importance of any fascinating new weapon. And these would be very new and very fascinating. Military powers across the globe would begin to take far greater interest in balloons than they had before. even the British. What was previously the weird French thing would now still be a weird French thing, but potentially useful. And while they might not be so inclined to make their own, they would want to find a way to combat them. With the right winds, these things could one day fly right over the Strait of Dover. And with relations between the two empires on shaky ground, it wasn't out of the question. And the British would ask themselves, how do we counter this? How do we stop a flying armada? The answer is, they couldn't. Sure, a cannon shot into the air might be able to hit a balloon, but it's equally likely to fly hundreds of feet in any other direction, hit a local school. At higher altitudes, the balloons would be untouchable. Nothing could counter them, except for more balloons. You would need to find a way to propel the balloon independently of the wind. This would allow one balloon to approach the other, and fight it on level ground, so to say. Concepts of powered dirigibles existed, although they were highly impractical. The limit to how much a balloon can carry is based on several factors, including volume. The larger the volume, the more lift it has, and the more it can carry. To get something that could be strong enough to lift a steam engine, along with the required fuel and the crew, well, it would need to be a rigid airship. Rigid airships are, unlike hot air balloons, rigid. They have a solid frame that contains several bags within to allow for more lift. But no material available at this time could create the structurally sound, lightweight frame for a rigid airship. Iron would be too heavy and too brittle to support a massive frame like this, and the only option in the early 1800s would be maybe steel? It's not a perfect solution, it's still very heavy, and certainly not a great substitute for the aluminum and duralumin frames that would be used in our timeline. Aluminum was so difficult to produce at this time, it was so rare that it cost more per ounce than gold. Hydrogen had to be made in laboratories, and while balloons would be filled with these on occasion, it wasn't being mass-produced. Really, the missing ingredient here was electricity, or electrolysis specifically. You need this to mass-produce both hydrogen and aluminum, and widespread access to electricity wouldn't be available for a long time. It simply wouldn't be possible given the technology at the time, even in an alternate one where everyone is infected with balloon fever. You see, there's another form of balloon warfare we don't really talk about. Unmanned balloon bombs. Yeah, these were a thing that actually existed. First flying over Venice in 1849. They were pretty simple in their design. Just balloons with a bomb attached to them. No pilot, no steering, just let it go and hope it goes where you want it to. And while the effectiveness of this weapon has been disputed in our history, this would be the perfect weapon for a cash-strapped and barely industrial United States, seemingly. So the War of 1812 would be kind of the perfect opportunity to test out these new weapons. A fledgling United States going up against the big bad Britain once again. I could imagine these weapons being used up north, with the US invasion of Canada. While a well-fired musket could maybe take out a balloon, it couldn't stop them all, and even the one shot down would still result in shrapnel bombs falling on the streets below. Shock and awe would be the strategy of these weapons. An unstoppable force unlike anything used in combat before, targeting both civilians and military alike, until the winds shift. More than likely, the balloons would just float into some trees and give away the Americans' position, or even worse, just blowing back into their faces before exploding. The first engine-powered airship in our timeline was actually created all the way back in 1852, the Gifford dirigible. It was powered by a lightweight steam engine, although it really wasn't capable of generating enough power to go against the wind. But this experiment, and experiments like it, developed without access to military resources or funding, still managed to do impressive things. So imagine if people actually cared. What if there was incentive and money and support to build this technology up? Then maybe airships could have had a much larger impact on the latter half of the 19th century. So in the 1860s, the United States became a lot less united. The Civil War began. In our timeline, hot air balloons were used by both the North and the South for reconnaissance, but in this alternate timeline, both sides would be a lot more ambitious. Now, the South wasn't as industrialized as the North, meaning that producing anything resembling a proper airship would be completely out of the question. But for the Union, it might actually make a lot of sense. As the war really started to heat up, the North begins engaging in more total war tactics, not only attacking troops and military outposts, but cities and civilians. We can only speculate what the Union might have been able to build, but we can assume it might have been a significant improvement over Gifford's dirigible. Concepts from the 1850s show an airship that kind of resembles a flying fish, I guess? Yeah, it's quite a bit different than the traditional interpretation of a steampunk airship, but it's definitely more realistic. Something that prioritizes being lightweight, but also allows for stability and control while being in the air. This wouldn't be able to lift that much, so you wouldn't have a lot of options when it comes to weaponry. Gotta have something that doesn't weigh too much, something that doesn't require any real degree of accuracy either, but can still do a decent amount of damage. So, fire. Incendiary weapons have been used in warfare for a long time, but if you want to start a fire in enemy territory, you usually have to get pretty close to the enemy territory, which is easier said than done. This is where the airship would come in handy. You could just fly over the enemy troops, ignore their formations, and go straight for whatever you wanted. Having flammable weapons on a machine that is filled with inflammable gas is probably a bad idea, but you gotta think, even Gifford's dirigible managed to use a steam engine without exploding. Hydrogen can be dangerous, yeah, but with the right safety precautions, this could work. Maybe. It would be slow. It would need to take off right outside a city, and the wind would need to be pretty calm. If it flies too high, it's not going to be able to do too much. 19th century firebombs dropped from 1,000 feet might not do that much damage. But the lower this thing flies, the easier it becomes for the enemy to hit it. This would be a mostly useless weapon, but a very valuable tool. Its real purpose would be, well, a literal propaganda machine. A symbol of the industrialized North using its tools to burn southern cities to the ground. A point of pride for the Union, and a reminder for the Confederacy how brutal their enemies could be. The South, on the other hand, could retaliate with one of those tried and true balloon bombs, which, much like the Union airship, probably wouldn't be all that effective as a weapon, but it would still make for some good propaganda. Like, imagine Washington, D.C. surrounded by balloons that, if they explode when they touch the ground, light the city on fire. Or light something on fire. It doesn't matter, it would be pretty memorable. A point of Southern pride. But neither of these would change the outcome of the war. The American Civil War would be the first instance of an airship being used in battle, and I'm sure many industrialized nations would take note. And there would be serious concerns. While we would know that the airship and balloon bombs would be mostly useless, most people wouldn't. It would just seem like the Union used this unbelievable aircraft to destroy southern cities, even if most of the damage was done by troops on horseback. This would definitely lead to militaries taking the threat of airships seriously. They would continue developing their own aircraft, but more importantly, begin investing in ways to take these things down. In our timeline in the 1870s, the French used balloons to get people out of the city of Paris during a Prussian siege. The Prussians responded by building what they called a balloon cannonus, a gun designed specifically for shooting balloons. It was massive, moved around by horse-drawn carriage, and while the accuracy and effectiveness of the gun is debatable, it did manage to take down 8 balloons. These things weren't unstoppable, they were just hard to hit, and most nations didn't bother trying to hit them. It wasn't a priority, but in this alternate timeline, it would be. Nobody would know what airships were truly capable of. Not militaries, or engineers, heads of state, or especially civilians. This could spark an arms race, where every side is assuming the enemy is capable of flying over their borders and destroying their cities within hours. The reason anti-aircraft tech took so long to develop in our timeline was because there just wasn't a reason to develop it. But if every nation is scared about getting invaded by unstoppable flying machines, they're gonna put some time and money into finding a solution. railway guns, mechanical computers. Yeah, that stuff actually did exist in our timeline. Tracer rounds were being developed, explosive rounds, automatic weapons, but the airship itself still wouldn't be that useful. You would only want to use it in very specific circumstances, when the enemy couldn't be expecting it, the battleground had to be close to a nation's home, and most importantly, the fate of the battle couldn't rely on these airships at all, because once again, not that useful. 1903 would be an exceptionally important year, not because of the Wright brothers building the first heavier-than-air flying machine. Oh no, Alberto Santos Dumont would have done that well before this point. Look him up. Nah. See, in 1903, this crew in Kansas found natural gas. Now, in this alternate timeline, this would be the moment that leads to a gold rush. To get not necessarily natural gas, but a byproduct of it. Helium. Helium is lighter than air, just like hydrogen, but it won't catch fire. While it can't lift as much as hydrogen does, it's still pretty important for airships, because again, it doesn't catch on fire. This would spark more fears across the world, and eventually, whether it be due to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand or something else, the global war would begin, and the airships would finally get their chance to shine. In our timeline, the most devastating use of airships was the raids on London, where Zeppelins attacked the city 159 times. These unstoppable flying machines, targeting civilians, doing untold damage, and the final death toll was 557, which means for every Zeppelin attack on the city, less than 5 people died on average. In this alternate timeline, with every nation aware and preparing for what they expect to be a massive fleet of highly capable airships, nothing would happen. Technologies like radar might have advanced a bit quicker with incentive to stop these aerial raids. Tracer rounds could have helped spot airships at night. There would be more than enough ways to stop the airships if they even managed to approach a city. And this is because they just weren't that fast, and they weren't that capable. And by this point, in this alternate World War I, the age of the airship, at least in warfare, would come to an end. In our timeline, ironically, this is when airships would begin their golden age. The raids on London, like I said, left an impact. Nations saw this and thought, hey, we should probably make our own. Yeah, so that's the thing about airships. Their design was not ideal for warfare. Ironically, if militaries had embraced this new technology earlier than in our timeline, it would simply accelerate the death of the airship. Kind of. While these things might have not been useful for invading neighboring countries, they would be useful for passengers looking to cross the ocean, or just a leisurely flight around the country. Even in our timeline, for decades, many people doubted that the airplane would ever be capable of competing with the airship. And in this scenario, these feelings would be even stronger. And unlike in our timeline, many of the obvious safety issues would have been probably addressed. If airships were developed earlier, a Hindenburg-style disaster would have never happened by the 1930s, or at least in a way that it happened in our timeline. Not because the airship would use helium, but because the outside of the craft would be designed to limit the buildup of static electricity, while the airship would eventually fall out of favor, getting replaced by planes. There's a possibility that the golden age of these machines could have lasted decades. Yeah, they would have become obsolete either way, but at least in this alternate timeline, they would have had a much stronger legacy.